Hello and welcome to another episode of the Discomfort-Zone podcast. It's good to be here again. I'll start off by saying that all of the theories and opinions you hear in this show are entirely my own and don't represent MSP Waves or anyone else. So if you were here last week, we managed to make do with what was, and I hope this week will go a bit better. But I'm going to jump right into it because we have a lot to get through as usual. So I wasn't really sure where to end this episode, so we'll just see how far we get. I'll welcome everyone in chat, Gabriel and Crimson Clad, Lax and Rondon. Thank you very much for joining. So last week was a very quick and very general outline of part of the Sumerian tales about the creation of man and what led up to it. And so I'd like to start now to go a bit further into the tale and into a few of the details and basically continue with that narrative. So before we start talking specifically about the details, there's one theme that I'd like to introduce, one idea that I'd like to talk about first, and that is the idea of myth, myths, and the age of myth, what is known as. And this concept is a very interesting one. I personally, in my development, went through a lot of different opinions about this concept. At first, before I'd actually heard of it as a child, I basically believed all of these stories that were known as myths to be true accounts of history, just like the books that I was reading about 50 years ago were true accounts of history that I didn't know about, that I was told about. But then I sort of grew up a bit older, and actually, as some of you may know if you've been here from the start, as I became an atheist, I rejected all of mythology as being made up nonsense of people of old. And the people today who believe in them are just as ridiculous. And so it was a complete rejection. And basically, sort of looking at it today, the way I viewed it was that all of those people and cultures and everyone was just completely ignorant as to how the world works. And I was very young back then, I'll just say that. And then came an interesting development in my idea of this, in my understanding of this idea of myths, where I was suddenly introduced to more of a Jungian concept of myths as parts of human psychology, and the importance of myths and tales are of helping us to both understand ourselves, to investigate psychological concepts, and to hopefully get some form of healing and therapy out of studying these common narratives, these common psychological tendencies through myths. And so that was one side of mythology that sort of took on an air of truthfulness, not because it was honest accounts of history, but because it bared a relationship to reality and a relationship that I could also benefit. The other side of that was learning a little bit about these cultures and understanding a bit more about where they were coming from. I basically came across this notion of mythology as being used as a form of poetry to describe the world, as opposed to, let's say, the scientific method where we describe the physical attributes and the form and the way that it behaves and interacts. The mythological view would be to look at things as a story that's being told. So when they are saying that they climbed up the hill and they met the god of wind at the top, what they're actually saying is that there's a very strong wind that comes right at the edge, and in describing that interaction, they give it a more poetic, anthropomorphized setting. And so this was another way that mythology turned from being absolute nonsense and useless to something that was in a sense real. If it's not historical, accurate writings, it's at least in some way psychological or literary, bearing a relationship with reality. Carl Jung, Jungian psychology. I'm not an expert, obviously, but I did take a very keen interest in Jung and a lot of his work. If in any way it actually, some of it relates to what I'm going to talk about here as well. He's a man who dealt very intensely with marrying the scientific method and rationality with the mythical, with the archetypal, with the psychological, spiritual, and ultimately esoteric side of things. And the term that we know today as synchronicity, if those who don't know, is actually termed by him as this phenomenon of an interconnectedness between events in different times and places that defies rational explanation. Very interesting. But his talking of archetypes and understanding these figures and sort of characters and narratives that are relatable throughout the ages, from, in our example, Sumerian culture all the way to today. And hopefully we're going to touch on that a little bit. But then I came across Sitchin and various others. And suddenly these ancient mythologies, which I was actually quite interested in, I started from Greek mythologies and read a lot of that. And obviously as a Westerner, that's probably one of the first mythologies that we come across, beyond obviously the Jewish mythology, which isn't considered mythology by the Jews because for them it's considered, historical, or at the very least sort of allegorical. We only call things myths if they're, if there's a tendency to believe they're untrue, and to us, one thing is a myth, and to someone else that can be their belief, as is our case here. So once I'd come across these writings and this idea, I started seeing these mythologies not only as tales and allegories and stories that we can learn from, but in part a description of their experience of reality, however mistranslated or missing or incomplete it may be. With some of these myths, the people who were writing them were, in their eyes, recounting historical events and trying to capture reality. And so I'll give one example of this. Sitchin, in his books, goes through a whole load of examples, and there are many different ones. And the one that I'll choose to use in this show is the myth of the flood, the deluge. So for many, many years, obviously in the Bible, there's the story of the flood, and in many, many different cultures from around the world, as anthropology came across new cultures that weren't discovered before, we find this myth of the Great Flood appearing again and again. And so for the longest time, it was exactly that, a myth. And in fact, I checked this just today because I was interested. If you look up in Wikipedia under that entry, you'll find there is the myth of the deluge, I think, the deluge myth, something along those lines. But it's categorized as a myth. And a myth, as we said, is something that's believed to be inherently untrue. Recently, or relatively recently, we've actually discovered that following the end of the last ice age, there were cataclysmic events worldwide, which both raised the sea level by a few meters, I can't remember exactly, rather abruptly, and had these giant, massive sort of ice, almost like continents grinding across and traveling around the globe, wreaking tremendous havoc. So obviously, when we hear this word flood, or when the Bible says it rained for 40 days and 40 nights, we're not necessarily sure that that's exactly what is being described. And here's the important thing about myths. Whenever we're told, I believe, whenever we're told about some kind of myth, we're going to get a combination of some kind of truth and that person's agenda, perspective, the culture and the time that it's in, all of these things. So the names and the places can change, and all of these different translations through cultures will change what's told in the tale. We can obviously see this. But when we see so many different cultures from around the globe agreeing about some kind of cataclysmic global flood, which was an event that affected all of the cultures, it seems to be something else. And as indeed science has discovered, there is evidence that such an event has taken place. And so even though we now have the evidence to support it, according to Wikipedia, it's still a myth. So this is an idea that comes up again and again, especially in Sitchin's writings. A lot of the ideas and theories that were historically held were obviously dismissed, along with both the scientific era and lacking any kind of physical evidence to support it, which is understandable. I'm not criticizing that way of thinking. But recently, let's say over the last century, more or less, there have been a lot of archaeological digs and findings which are seriously challenging the current notion. This isn't just speaking specifically about the Annunaki or Sitchin's work, but generally in archaeology, there are many, many more findings today dating far, far further back than there ever have been. Another example, not from archaeology, but rather from astronomy, is again the tablets, the clay tablets that were found from the Sumerian cultures. A lot of them are depicting the solar system. Now, today we say that the solar system that they're depicting has 12 planets. But back when they were discovered, there were still many undiscovered planets, namely the three outer planets, Pluto, Uranus, and Neptune. And so if you're looking at a solar system with 4 planets that you've yet to discover, you might not recognize that that's a solar system. You might think that it's something else or whatever. As time went on, so far we have discovered 3 of the missing 4 planets, and now there's one that we still haven't discovered. So that leads us to a place, or that leads me to question, what is the tendency here? We didn't believe in the first 3 until we actually found them, and now the last one is left. And the same with the archaeological digs. Obviously, there is a limit to where we can extend this theory. But when we're dealing with these things, if we look at the course of history and see how much we undervalued past cultures, both in their abilities, their history, seeing these hardcore evidence being brought now about cavemen, painting these different paintings in very, very old caves, etc. This is all should be leading us to a change in the way that we view these things. And so when we're approaching this subject and when I'm talking about these things, I'd like to ask you to maintain a little bit of sort of humility as to how much we really know in our age when it comes to these ancient myths that at once seemed completely impossible and bared no physical reality until a certain layer in the earth was brought forth and we could find the evidence to support it. So with that being said, without further ado, let's jump right in. So last week we spoke about all of the arrival of the Annunaki. And before we move forward, there's just one note that I wrote myself. I want to correct one small detail that I mentioned. I spoke about Anu, who was the king of the Annunaki in their home planet, the king of Nibiru. And I said that he was the predecessor's king's son, Alalu. He wasn't his son. Alalu was his distant uncle, so they were related, but it wasn't father-son. So I just want to correct that. So we have the Annunaki who arrived here, and when they actually arrived, let's look into their characters a bit more closely, because this is going to be showing up time and time again, and this relates to our archetypes and the way that we view these characters. So we have these 2 characters, Enki and Enlil. and they are definitely the driving force of this tale. Now, Enki is the first to land on Earth, and he is the scientist. He is charged with all of the technical know-how and that aspect of things. Now, the interesting fact is that Enki is the firstborn. He's the firstborn of Anu, the king, but he is born of a concubine. He isn't the son of the queen of Anu's wife, Antu. Enlil is the second, born the second son, and he is born of the queen. And so this is the beginning, at least of the stories that we come across, of the rift between these two brothers. Both feel that they have the right to inherit and to become the rightful heir. Enki because he is the firstborn, and Enlil because he is the only or the first true son of both king and queen. And for those who are not as familiar in the Bible, in the Old Testament, as I am, this is a theme that we see throughout the Old Testament time and time again. Sibling rivalry, strictly about inheritance, about being the heir, the older son often not being chosen, and the younger actually being chosen. And in this story, Enlil is technically the younger. So, when Enki first arrived, he was here alone, and he had the Annunaki under his command, and they set up base here, and they started their operation. Later, when the gold was discovered and started to be brought back, Enlil, who was more of a commander than a scientist, was sent in to take control of the whole operation. And so it was at that point that sort of Enki, who had established this and done everything until then, had to relinquish his position of power to Enlil. So there is a certain tension, and in fact, that tension grows over time. But in the beginning, Enki seems to be accepting his role as sort of second, as it were, and instead choosing to bide his time. And it seems from the story that his behavior is really an attempt to undermine Enlil in the most subtle and secretive ways, so as not to be detected. Now, at this point, it's important to remember what we just said about myths, because the story that Sitchin tells, and throughout all of his books, is really told from Enki's perspective. And if you look at these tales in each one of the religions of the cultures that they were told, you have a different god being portrayed as the, quote unquote good guy, and an opposite god portrayed as the bad guy. Or in the Jewish case, no opposite god, but there is always a side that is chosen to portray or to be portrayed as the good and another as the bad. And so the story that Sitchin tells portrays Enki in the good light, and that's why this whole story is going to be with that. But in the following episodes, when Drew Melchizedek talks about it, when Gerald Clark talks about it, there's a bit of a different perspective. For me personally, I won't go into my opinion too deeply now, because we'll get into that later on. But it has to be said that we should always remember, whenever one side is portrayed, we're only hearing half the story. Okay? But with that being said, Enki is sort of, pushed to the sidelines. And I mean, not really the sidelines, because he's given control of the whole mining operation, which is in Africa, specifically in South Africa, that area. And Enlil is given control of the main operation in Mesopotamia, in sort of the area of Iraq nowadays. So these two brothers are sort of running the show, and they're the ones who are telling this story in the narrative. And the other Annunaki, there are 12 of them eventually on Earth in the end. So Enki and Enlil and 10 others. And then under them are the sort of, not the reigning Annunaki, but the workers of various degrees, and there's this whole hierarchy. And then underneath all of those, there are the Ijiji that we were talking about. And so, as we mentioned, the Ijiji who were working in the mines were suffering, were toiling, and they eventually rebelled against it. when they came to Enlil, at first, he actually was completely abhorred by the idea that these people were daring to go against his word, and he was ready to start attacking the Igigi who were working there. But he was given a sort of a command from Anu to listen to Enki, and instead to go ahead with his suggestion of creating this earthling, this man. Hang on, I've just got a question. No questions are dumb in this show. If anything, then yeah, not to worry. What time on Earth was this happening? So the timing of all of this I purposely don't mention because there's obviously a lot of disagreement. If you would like to know Sitchin's timeline, the Anunnaki arrived 450,000 years ago. And then the process of the Anunnaki who were toiling until they decided they could work no more was described, if I'm not mistaken, you can look at this all up, but if I'm not mistaken, it was 40 Shahs. Now, a Shah, which often is translated as a year in most of the texts, is actually a Niburian year, which is the amount of time it takes Nibiru to complete to revolve around the sun, which is 3,600 Earth revolutions or years. So 3,600 years times 40, and then 450,000 minus that. So it's around, I can't remember the exact date, but it's around 30 to 50,000 years ago, more or less, the idea of creating man. That's what it's dated. Now, if we look at the arrival, you know what? As I'm going to carry on talking, I will attempt to look up the exact timeline because I don't remember the numbers exactly. Now, as I said, these are Sitchin's numbers, and his calculations are done from a lot of different things, from the different artifacts that are found, but also a lot of it from the Bible and from other, Sumerian texts, etc. Different. If you, I mean, there's this whole field in Judaism of the timeline and dating things and when things happened, and the Jewish calendar is different from the Gregorian. It's the year, I don't know exactly, but 5,600 and something, if I'm not mistaken, 5,700 and something, and that's the year that's being counted from the creation of man, which is worked out through the generations that are counted. A lot of these different timelines don't add up. And when I talk about similar events that Druval or Melchizedek or other people, they don't always line up. The reason for this is that dating is a very, very difficult science because, I mean, even the scientific community agrees with that. Whether we're talking about carbon dating, etc., we come into estimations, and the smaller the numbers get, like 10,000 years and smaller, the harder it is to be accurate. So that's the general outline of when we're talking about. They were here for probably 200,000 years, more or less, according to Sitchin again, before anything happened with humans or the apes. And so the majority of the period was actually before. But in terms of the human interaction, etc., we're talking about several tens of thousands of years back, sort of BC, as it were. Okay, so, but no, yes, great question. Definitely not a dumb question. And if you are interested, you can find the Sitchin timeline. In fact, I might look up, because there was a great website that showed the two timelines, historical, like scientific, and the Sitchin timeline, sort of in parallel on the same page. So, with that being said, when, as I was saying, that the Igigi rebelled, Anu commanded Enlil to grant Enki permission to create this primitive worker who could replace the gods in their work. And so here is a sort of a rift between the two. Although there's a lot to be said for why Enki proposed it, it is certainly one of the opinions that Enki wanted this as a way to sort of take some control back from Enlil, to have this big project and be in charge of it. Enlil couldn't usurp his authority because he didn't have the scientific know-how. And some of the texts in the Lost Book of Enki, it's told that Enki was actually one of the sort of he inflamed the Ijiji rebellion, and he was one of the primary causes of it, obviously behind the scenes and subtly, because he was trying to orchestrate this. Having said that, his agenda for creating the man was not only sort of selfish, but definitely he, in his descriptions at least, he came to fall in love with Earth, with the creatures here, and to ponder the Anunnaki's role in human evolution, especially over time as he see where his actions led. He was, along with the other Anunnaki, very surprised. As far as they were concerned, I think, it seems, they were very much thinking of creating a mule, a work animal that has some good genetics on either side, that can work the tools, understand commands, and looked no further than there. And it certainly seems to have been a slight, I think, surprise to them. We'll see how all this fits more as time goes by. I have to say that these subjects are sort of very, very thick. They're like quite lateral. There's a lot of information and background that needs to go in to sort of grasp a lot of these things. So I apologize if it's a little bit of a back and forth, but I'm trying to construct it. So I like see further in the future where we're building towards, but it's going to take a little while to get there. So if you're patient, I promise we will get there in the end. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the creation of man. And this is an interesting subject, obviously, not just for us, but in terms of the Sumerian perspective. So in fact, when we look at the Babylonian myth or tale of the creation of man, we see that there was this very clear insistence that man was created to unburden the gods, to alleviate the toil, and that was the purpose that he was brought forth. Now, what I said before about myths and different things, the Babylonian tale is based on the earlier Sumerian version, and we can see, I think, with confidence, it's quite clear that the Hebrew, the Jewish creation story is also based on the earlier Sumerian tale. And that is because the two of them share part, but each one shares a different part. And so the Babylonian tale talks about man's purpose of unburdening, the Hebrew tale focusing on the detail that man was created out of clay. And what exactly this means, I think, might be a little bit interesting, let's just say. So, as we see, the Sumerian story is much, much longer and much more ripe with details than these two versions, which seem to have chosen to edit certain bits out. And it's very clear that the procedure, the sort of scientific medical procedure that was taking place, was extremely important to be captured in totality. Now, having said that, the procedure was captured in the Sumerian language, within Sumerian concepts, obviously, for the Sumerian people, and so it's going to be, as we said, lacking. Once it's translated, once it's crossed over to a culture that doesn't understand the science behind the process, these words that we're going to choose to use are going to be different than what we would choose today. So I would like to talk a little bit about that word clay. And Sitchin goes into a lot of detail about the whole process, and even he doesn't cover everything, but there's one specific part that he talks, which is the importance of the earthly clay, and that is part of it, and that's mixed with the divine blood. And so there are these two elements that are mentioned, this clay and this blood, and those words are obviously very old words, old concepts, as it were, things that were clearly understood by everyone, and yet they seem to be representing something else here. And so the whole story of how man came to be created started with a lot of, it seems, trial and error. And so when Enki first set out, he was looking for a work animal that would be suitable for what they were trying to do. And apparently, it's understood that what he did was he tried to crossbreed these apes, these proto hominids, with other animals, with other beasts. And this appears to have not worked at all. It's told about different, problems that arose, and all of these creatures had some kind of ailment or disability that made them completely, unable to be used. And so Enki continued his search to no avail, and eventually it seems that he came across the idea to cross the ape man with the Annunaki. And so this is the first meaning that we see for the term clay, meaning part of the earth, as it were, and the blood representing the other race, the Anunnaki, the mixture of the, in their terms, high and the low. And so in the second the second chapter of Genesis, we have this quote that says, Yahweh Elohim fashioned the Adam of the clay of the soil, and he blew in his nostrils the breath of life. And then Adam turned into a living soul. And so I actually looked up the Hebrew original that it was translated, and that's pretty much how I would translate it, I have to say. So the two terms that I'd like to point out, you know what, give me a minute, I'm actually going to put that up on chat, because I think it's sometimes easier when you see it in front of you. So in this quote, we can basically see that in the Hebrew text, the word blood from the Sumerian, or at least that translation, is changed to this word breath of life, as it were. And so we can see he fashioned him of the clay of the soil and blew in his nostrils the breath of life. And it was only then that Adam turned into a living soul. So let's ask, what is this breath of life, this blood that's being talked about, this element? Well, in Hebrew, it's actually a common misconception. We have different terms. So let me just say, I'll start off by saying this. What Sitchin is talking about here, the concepts that we're talking about, are getting to be more and more esoteric. And so when we're talking about that special energy that sustains life, it seems to be a subject that science is still struggling with trying to define, although many scientists have spoken about it and even experimented with it in different ways. I think, Freud called it libido, and William Reich called it organon, and all of these different people were experimenting with this or experiencing this vital energy that separates, that distinguishes between animate and inanimate, organisms. And so when we're talking about the creation of this man, as scientific as it is, we always have to remember that the theology that was held at the time is going to play a crucial part in the understanding and presentation of these concepts. So I'm hoping as time goes and as we delve deeper into this, we're actually going to go further into the esoteric subjects. And when we're talking about the creation of man, this whole tale is very much on a physical representation, very much talking about science, DNA, material, blood. There is a whole other aspect to this story which is told elsewhere, which is a much more spiritual, energetic, ethereal perspective on it. But having said that, there's no escaping the fact, as Sitchin finds it important enough, and indeed as the Sumerians found it important enough, to note that it was only once, God, Elohim, the divine, breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, that Adam turned into a living soul. So in Hebrew, we have these three terms, as it were. And we have the first term for body, which is guf. Then we have a term that would be probably translated as soul, and that is nefesh. And then we have this word spirit. and that's usually neshama. Now, the reason I say that is because, well, both in English, I think, if people were hard pressed to say what the difference between a spirit and a soul is, it's a little bit, I think, individual. We don't have a complete agreement. And it's the same in Hebrew. But nonetheless, there is some kind of agreement that there is the body, the physical, the vessel, and there is this something else that when the body is still there, nonetheless, it appears to be not among the living. So this is the term that's used in the Bible, the term nishmat chaim, neshama. Now, the term that's then used for describing what Adam turned into, a living soul, is the term nefesh, nefesh chaya. So in English, the translation that Sitchin used is differentiating between the two by using the term breath of life to describe nishmat chaim, and living soul to describe nefesh chaya. So these two terms are talking about that otherly, that different element, as it were. And when we look at the terms, we can see that the role of the blood appears, although subtly, in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew version as well. And so, as I've mentioned a few times, I think a lot of Sitchin's work is based on language and based on translations, and indeed understanding some lost meanings, some hidden meanings, as it were, that are lost in translations. And so when words are taken or borrowed by different languages, often the dual significance, the dual meaning that can be in the original language is lost, and only one of those meanings is held onto. And so that's why we can lose a lot of the layers. And Sitchin, I think, does a really amazing work of uncovering these things and using the language and tracing the etymology of these words throughout different cultures. I can see just quickly a chat. Who is Sitchin? Well, first of all, if you haven't heard the introduction episode, I speak a little bit more about him. But yes, Sitchin is one of the, well, he is actually the main theorist and researcher who I'm talking about now in this part. And then in further episodes, in future episodes, we're going to be talking about other people as well. But he is the main, in fact, the books that he's written are really more or less what I'm talking about in these episodes. So I do recommend to anyone who wants to read them. But for now, let us delve a little bit more deeply, thank you, Lax, excellent, into how the concept of this blood enters the Hebrew story. And the term is actually Adamah. Now, there is a known correlation to anyone who studies these things, anyone in Israel, that the first Adam, the word that we know, Adam, as it were today, actually stems from this other word, this other root, which is Adamah, which really means soil or earth, as it were. There are a few different words for these different things, obviously, but Adamah means like the ground that you're standing on. And so as Adam was made from the soil, and that's what it said, the soil from the land, Afar min Adamah, so as it were, soil from the land, yeah. It's understood that that's why that term comes to mean Adam. But I didn't know this. In fact, the original meaning of that word was not just any earth or soil, but specifically the red, that sort of dark red earth, clay earth. In Hebrew, it's called today chamra. And it's sort of this very deep reddish clay, and that was the word that referred to that specific type of clay, that Adamah, in the ancient Sumerian. Now, in Akkadian, the word is Adamatu, and again, we can see the similarity between those. Now, what I'd never noticed, as it were, is that both of these words bear an uncanny relationship to the word dam. Adam, Adamah, and dam. The word dam in Hebrew means blood. So here we can see that in the Sumerian original texts, the term Adam that was chosen for the being, as it were, has, the two meanings in it. One, that it was an earthling made from earth, from the soil, as it were, the clay, and the other, that he was made from the blood. And so let's look a little bit into more of what this could actually mean. Well, when we look at the Akkadian, the Mesopotamian tales, and this is what is important as we were talking about the different myths. Sitchin is constantly crossing between different languages and different tales and gleaning the information from each that coalesce together to create a larger story. And so the name in the Mesopotamian tale for the basically the hospital that the creation of man was taking place in, as it were, the hospital, was Shimti. But the Mesopotamian Shimti comes from the more ancient Sumerian term Shi-Imti. Now, with those syllables, as it were, taken separately in the Sumerian language, all the words are made up of syllables, and the syllables have meaning themselves. And so Shi-Imti literally translates to breath, wind, life. But the term Shimti as a whole literally means the house where the wind of life is breathed into. So here we see again that reference to the breath of life and it being so crucial for this, mission, as it were, that they are on, that it is encoded into the name. And then again, the name takes on a different meaning of itself, and Shimti can translate into another language, missing all of the underlying meaning that is encoded into the Sumerian syllables. So when you look at the translation, the Akkadian word in the Mesopotamian tale was Napishtu. And Napishtu is tremendously close again to Nefesh, which again relate to this something ethereal, something in the blood, as it were. So what is it? What was this actual thing? Well, when we talk about these, specifically this story, we're talking about Sitchin's perspective. And so he actually quotes someone else, and I think, you know what, I'm gonna try and, I'm gonna copy the quote here as well. And this is a quote from another researcher actually who isn't Sitchin, and he is, I have his name here, Professor R. Millard of Oxford University. Okay. He and W.G. Lambert, they are basically experts on these Sumerian tales and Mesopotamian, and they say that the divine element wasn't just the blood of a god, as it were, the actual dripping blood, but something more basic and lasting. So the term that was used to describe this thing was Tiema. Now, they translate that term as being, here's the translation. The ancient term is much more specific. Yes, the ancient term is much more specific. It literally means that which houses that which binds the memory. Further on, the same term appears in the Akkadian version as etemu, which is translated as spirit. So that definition, that translation, that which houses that which binds the memory, really strikes me as something special, because if you think about it, that really is an sort of ancient culture's way of understanding what Sitchin has translated as a DNA strand. And so with all of these different findings, as Sitchin was suggesting, the Annunaki who arrived here obviously were much more technologically advanced even than we are today. If indeed this is true, then they came from outer space, which is further than we could ever travel. And so obviously their other fields, medicine included, would be more advanced. It's understandable. But how do you explain a concept like DNA to a culture that is learning to farm, who believe in these gods and tales as if, as supernatural beings, not as intelligent creatures that they could one day aspire to become. And so I really liked that definition of that which houses, that which binds the memory, is a really clear way of describing something like DNA. So let's see what time it is. Okay, 1:45. I've got 15 minutes. Okay, I think that should actually work out pretty well. So if we move just a little bit forward, we come to the story of Adam and Eve. Now, in the Bible, when we read through these stories, there are basically two verses, one after the other. One, God creates man from the rib, and then the next, God puts him in the Garden of Eden in order to work. And it appears from the story in the Bible that this was immediate, basically. The Sumerian tale tells a very different story, and again, this employs the two brothers and the understanding of their independent roles, as it were. So Enki was charged with creating this Adam, this man, and once he did so, he was in Africa in the mining operations. He put the man to work there, but he kept him in that area, and he wasn't basically, allowed to travel out. And so Enlil and the other gods who were toiling, who were still working in the fields to grow the food for everyone, were obviously rather upset about this. And so they were the ones who sort of demanded from Enlil, who then demanded indeed to release, as it were, the humans and allow them to replace the workers in the Garden of Eden as well. And so we read in the actual Bible, on the day that Elohim created Adam, in the likeness of Elohim did he make him, male and female created he them, and he blessed them and called them Adam on the very day of their creation. And then the deity Yahweh planted an orchard in Eden in the east, and he took the Adam and placed him in the Garden of Eden to work it and to keep it. And so this is the sort of beginning of the Bible story in terms of the relationship between God and man. And we see that in that relationship, sort of a lot happens very, very quickly. He's created, and very quickly it's feared that he will be in likeness as to the gods, and so he's forbidden from eating the fruit. And then, in a few verses later, basically, as he eats the fruit, he is then expelled from the garden and punished by God for the rest of time. And that story is, well, it's one story, but it seems rather abrupt and somewhat lacking. And it's interesting when we read through the Sumerian tales to get all of these other details, such as that the Creator and Jehovah and the God who placed man in work were not the same character, and they were in fact, as it were, rivals. So suddenly the story gets a different tale when we consider that the time that man spent in the Garden of Eden was much, much longer, and a lot seemed to have happened there in that time. So, okay, we've got about 10 minutes left. I think I'm going to stop there for now. Next week, I hope to carry on with, with all of the story with... We'll see. I actually hoped to get through a bit more today, but it seems I was talking a bit much. In terms of everyone's understanding, etc., do you have any questions, anything I skimmed over, didn't answer, etc., please let me know. The variance of a verbally dictated creation story. Absolutely. And yeah. I mean, these things occur time and time again, and yet we always seem to forget. And we are all taught that, what is it? To the victor's history, what do you call it? The victors write history in Hebrew. I can't remember the exact verb, the exact sentence. Sorry, but we still read the victor's tale, and we still believe what we're told. And time again, now I'm not suggesting that what I'm doing is that much different, but I certainly think that what Sitchin does, which very, very few other researchers do, is constantly jumps between and compares and contrasts and tries to trace the different stories that were rolled over different cultures and different generations to try and get the most accurate picture. And so normally, I mean, if you just look at the amount of information that Christianity has wiped off the face of the planet, it's really unnerving, to be honest. But nevertheless, we still get a lot of it, and we still get a lot from before because of these archaeological digs that are bringing up more and more information. Of course, it must remember that a lot of this information is still suppressed today. So whenever we hear about Sitchin's theories or some of these things, and it sounds quite mad and ludicrous, any evidence that we have to support it is really unbelievable when you consider the odds, when you consider how much has happened since then, how much time has passed. I mean, the fact that we have any of this is truly remarkable. The Library of Hammurabi, if any of you have heard, was discovered by accident by a farmer who was plowing and happened to come across some clay tablet. And thankfully, I think, I can't remember, there's some story, he wanted to sell it, he was wondering how much it was worth, he called in the society and they said, this is the only finding of that era that we have to dig this, and found an entire library. So it's really special, and I'm very much appreciative that we have these in place, but we must remember how many of them have been wiped out, how many narratives and tales that haven't been told. And so to hear this kind of narrative that's, I think, goes against just about any culture around today, because even the Sumerians certainly wouldn't understand it as just technology or something that we could do. To them, the gods who appeared were supernatural and divine and ordained and decided fates. And in fact, as we'll see, I hope in next week when we talk about the flood, the Anunnaki time and time again seem to exploit that fact and not only keep the humans in the dark as to the truth, but in fact manipulate them using these myths. Obviously, if we could imagine humans arriving on some distant planet, coming across aliens who were, well, who we created as it were, but definitely aliens who were less intelligent, it's very easy to see the allure of sort of using your increased intelligence to manipulate them to do your bidding, even if it's just working out in the fields, let alone waging war on an opposing god or brother that you despise. So we'll get into a bit more of that in the coming episodes. Okay, I can see a few people in chat. Let me just run through very quickly. The common thread is the history that's hidden from us in ancient civilizations. Absolutely. Far more common threads than just those hidden in the lost history. Some of it's hidden from public eyes. If you've noticed, the top 5 religions of the world are used to keeping us divided. Just imagine the history kept locked away in the Vatican Library. That's what I always say to people, the Vatican Library. If it's interesting to any of you, have a look. You'll be able to find a few things. There are some people. I remember one specific episode of a photographer who was hired because of the specific technology that his company had invented to be able to take pictures of documents beyond glass, in glass containers. And so he was hired by the Vatican because they wouldn't have to open the glass seal, which is obviously preserving these texts. And the technology, would be able to make an exact copy or whatever. And so he describes, not a lot, but some of the things that he saw there, and a lot of the things that he didn't, as it were. And it's a very interesting place. There's a lot of things that would be there. Yes, a document written by a pope exonerated some Knights Templar for his crimes. Kind on parchment. I'd never heard of that. I'll have to look it up. Thank you for letting me know. Yeah, let's raid the Vatican. It's not a, it's a country. Like you can imagine, that's invading another country. That's declaring war on the Vatican. It's quite unbelievable when you think about it. Yes, the Spanish Inquisition and Central American interaction during the New World pilgrimages is proof of a far more advanced civilization being seen as a group of gods coming to your unworthy people. Absolutely. Wow, that's very well said. And in fact, I'm just going to give you a sneak peek. Sitchin talks specifically, his whole book, the third book, I can't remember. Lost Civilizations, I think it's called. The Annunaki and Lost Civilizations. He goes into great deal about the South American interaction, and he claims, among other things, that the reason that the Incas and the cultures believed the Spaniards to be gods was because the earlier gods that they had met from obviously legends, but the gods who gave them all their gold, the gods who taught them, the aqua culture and all of the the designing of the buildings, etc., looked like the Spanish. They were white-haired, they had beards. The South Americans didn't have any beards, so it's interesting that the physical characteristics that were described as being similar to those of the gods, those were basically pertaining to gods, appeared in the Spanish who came as well. And in fact, the answer to that mystery seems to come, for me at least, from the other writings of Drunvalo Melchizedek and his whole story about Atlantis. So we have much to look forward to, a lot coming up ahead. I have to say that when I originally was planning sort of the layout and the podcast and what I was going to do, I thought I was going to give Sitchin like 5 episodes and sort of give each of these researchers 5 episodes to cover it. But so far, I'm seeing that I'm not quite managing to hold it at just that. So we'll see. We'll see how it goes. We'll see as we go forward. Obviously, I am choosing to edit a lot, but there's just a lot to get into, and there's a lot I think that's very important information. Okay. Before I finish, let me see, 2 minutes left. Okay. Before I go, I would like to say one thing to those who are listening. If these subjects are at all interesting to you, then you, as me, will be excited to know that there is a Brazilian Portuguese rock band who have just completed the first rock opera. It's an hour and a half, a full rock opera about the Sumerian tales of the Annunaki based on Sitchin's writings. So I don't know if you believe me. I kid you not. I've watched it. It's actually it's interesting. There are some things that I disagree with what Sitchin said. You know what? Stay on after the show, and I'll link it at the bottom. It's free on YouTube right now. You'll be able to watch it. So if you're interested in that, it's in Brazilian, but there are English subtitles, and it's interesting. The animation is like South Parky, but I think it's very, very interesting. So I just wanted to share that with you if you hadn't heard about it. It just came out a few months ago. That's it from me. Have a wonderful week. Thank you very, very much, and I'll see you next time. Bye.